One thing that with Fancy Comma, and I think that also Ivory Embassy does as well, what all you're doing is kind of like encouraging this critical thinking and sort of empowering people to feel confident that they can do this critical thinking so that they can speak up and be confident and kind of break through this kind of like the culture of like intimidation and expertise that's inherent in science that we're kind of learning is just primarily due to structural inequalities. Like anyone should be free to speak and think critically, and anyone is not free to think and speak critically.
Today, I have Sheeva Azma here with me. She has a lot of experience in science communication. Sheeva is the founder of science communications company Fancy Comma LLC. She wears many hats. She's a science communicator, a journalist, a strategist, science policy expert, educator, and an independent neuroscience researcher. Shiva has also recently published a book for science writers and other communicators that streamlines their marketing. So she has a quite impressive background. We're going to talk with Shiva about the state of science communication and how we can keep improving to create a more open and reliable dialogue between scientists and the general public. So Shiva, welcome to the channel. Super nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's amazing to be here and to talk to your community of scientific thinkers and critical thinkers that seek to transcend politicization and sort of partisanship and all that stuff, because that's really important. And that's where the problems get solved, is with everyone, not just with certain camps of people.
I've been following you for a while now, and have experienced your tremendous engagement in science social media with your company Fancy Comma, but also personally, you seem to be very active on social media and want to really transmit this concept of proper or sound science communication. Could you just share your journey into science communication, what you do, and what inspired you to enter this field?
I've had a lot of career goals over the years. When I went to MIT, for undergrad, I wanted to study chemical engineering and become a doctor. And then it turns out chemical engineering is kind of pretty hard, especially for someone that doesn't really like engineering. I mean, like, doesn't have the quantitative engineering mind. So I became a brain and cognitive science major, and then I worked as a research assistant in the functional magnetic resonance imaging, studying alcoholism and actually giving people alcohol like in the scanner and then seeing what happens to their brain. And then I went to graduate school at Georgetown, which is in Washington, D.C., and I chose it to be near the policy world. And I one day I walked into my advisor's office and my project it was underpowered. It was only had 12 subjects or 13 subjects and it wasn't going well. And I helped my advisor get another grant, but I was 5 years into my program and my advisor asked me, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I would like to do science policy and science communication. And my advisor was like, you don't really need a PhD to do that. So I left with a master's and I was like, I guess I'll apply to like government jobs since I'm in Washington, D.C. And um, to pay the bills, I just started freelance science writing and I took whatever jobs I could, writing Facebook articles about cheese, writing about like different supplements that had like vitamins in them. And so they wanted people to research the vitamins in PubMed and tell people what the science says about them. It was amazing to me how little people knew about science in the marketing world, and I didn't realize it, but I was apparently doing marketing, so I just did this for a while. Living in DC got expensive on a freelancer salary, so I moved back to Oklahoma, where I'm from and where I currently live, and I got itched for the politics bug again because I had done advocacy on Capitol Hill as a scientist and advocated for science funding. And so I got an internship to work in the House of Representatives, and I went there, and I was a writer by then because I was blogging and I was writing different articles and stuff. And so that skill was really valuable. And also the fact that I was a scientist was also really valuable. So I kind of like what was valuable to Congress was my science communication and science writing skills more than me actually being a scientist in a way, because they just needed someone that could write about science. And there wasn't anyone in our office that could do that, because I think I'm pretty sure I was the only scientist in our staff, and I was an intern, so I was the lowest person. So after I got back from that, I went $13,000 into debt because it was my dream to always work in Congress. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll just start freelancing more seriously. So I started Fancy Comma LLC a couple years later. Then 3 weeks after we started Fancy Comma, the pandemic happened. And of course, back then, there were very few people that had this dual marketing and sort of like this policy and marketing and science background. So then my whole day to day was just working and explaining science to people. And that's kind of what got me into this. And actually, because I had so much work at that time, I was kind of like, I don't have to do all this work. Like, why don't we just teach scientists to communicate better? And that would solve probably 99% of the problems we had in the pandemic. Encouraging diversity of thought, encouraging disagreeing with people. Because often in lab meeting, when I spoke up, it would be like the professor would say something, I would be like, that's either wrong or it's kind of not perfectly right. So I'd pipe up and say something. And then it was hard to speak up because people shoot down your ideas so quickly. It's hard to be that person that like goes against the grain and says something that's relevant. And so I wish, looking back with all the experiences I have, it's like the journey I've had, one thing that with Fancy Comma, and I think that also Ivory Embassy does as well, what all you're doing is kind of like encouraging this critical thinking and sort of empowering people to feel confident that they can do this critical thinking so that they can speak up and be confident and kind of break through this kind of like the culture of like intimidation and expertise that's inherent in science that we're kind of learning is just primarily due to structural inequalities. Like anyone should be free to speak and think critically, and anyone is not free to think and speak critically sometimes. And so a lot of my work as a science writing and science writing tutor is just helping people break through these mental blocks, because people are smart, like scientists are smart, they all have the right skills, but it's just this other stuff, this social aspect of like, oh, I'm afraid to speak up and say my point, or I don't want to write this because I know my advisor will tear it apart. So a lot of the stuff I've learned in my journey is actually not related to science at all, but it's related to this broader social context and empowering people to communicate better, by recognizing that context. And I think it's very hard to get this experience inside of academia, which is why I really, the path I've been on, I don't really recommend it to anyone, but I feel like I've been able to learn some really interesting stuff that can be used to improve science as an enterprise and to help scientists do more and be more empowered and powerful in the world.
So I see that there are certain contradictions in what people expect from the general audience. On the one hand, non-experts get criticized for not being informed enough, not being intelligent enough. But still, on the other hand, they get completely crushed if they try to engage in public discussions, especially when there are critical topics. And I've always advocated for an open and engaging dialogue where, just like you, where we can all participate in discussions, and especially the ones dealing with values. And then we can trust the scientific consensus in purely scientific matter. So what are your ideas about this? When can we do our own research, and how do you see the pursuit of improving scientific and independent thinking, so we can call it independent thinking, intellectual self-defense, in the context of science and science communication, or communication in general?
In this current time that we have, where we have so much information and we have AI trying to summarize it to us, regardless of whether we're a scientist or not, we all need good research skills because there's just so much information, and there's starting to be a lot of misinformation. Like Google had their rollout of their search engine and the AI blurb, and some of the AI blurbs are like honestly like super incorrect, and I wonder what's going to happen with that, because I I mean, I wonder if they will get sued for some of the information that they are passing off in their search blurbs because they're wrong. In this information age where we have information coming at us from everywhere, we can't tell if it's right or not. We have to do our own research. And that comes down to being a smart consumer of news, learning to vet sources. There's a new need in the age of generative AI for fact checking, for critical thinking, for being able to have those to check that the information you have is correct, knowing where to go to find the correct information. And you don't have to be a scientist to do this. And I think that everyone should be able to do this. And no, everyone is not able to do this right now. We should always be thinking independently and always empowering ourselves to do this research, regardless of whether we're a scientist or not. If we're a scientist, it's a lot easier because we know where to go, like especially for science issues. Like if I have a question about something, I can check PubMed or I can check Google Scholar and look at the sources. I'm a writing tutor right now, and a lot of people don't know how to use Google Scholar or they haven't heard of PubMed. Scientists kind of have an advantage there, but everyone needs to be able to think independently and critically.
And how do you think we can promote independent thinking among our audiences to help them engage in the discussions while critically evaluating scientific claims and content?
Well, I can tell you what I do. I have a very high standard for the information that I digest. I read an article, it was about something else. And then they had this critique of presidential politics. And I was like, I didn't come here to read about presidential politics. It was a completely different thing. So I, the skills are very simple. It's like vetting sources for bias. An example of this is when I was in college, the Iraq War was happening, and I noticed that I couldn't watch the US news because it was so biased. And for whatever reason, BBC had the best news, and I think because they weren't based in the US. So to avoid that bias and to get the best reporting, I just watched BBC's coverage of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And so the other thing is kind of doing a gut check with things that may not seem right, and remembering that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And doing those three simple things, I think that was three things, that will get rid of many of the problems that people have when vetting their sources, when trying to find out, like, are they really reading what's real or not? And I think that with the way AI is going, even experts are going to be deceived by that. I've been using generative AI increasingly to summarize papers for my clients and stuff, but I've noticed that sometimes it's not right. So I have to find where it says something, go and fact check.
Definitely. It would also be nice to open up a little bit, have a little bit more transparency talking about AI to see where it gets its information, how it makes its decisions. I mean, we know it's a bit of a what they call a black box, but there are things that can be a little bit more open and transparent when it comes to AI, especially if it's going to affect how we consume news or how do we communicate with each other. As a science communicator, what practical tips can you share with other communicators or aspiring science communicators on how to make complex scientific concepts more accessible while not patronizing your audience?
Yeah, I think that's really important, not to be patronizing or mean. It's kind of a tendency, we kind of have this tendency as scientists. We're like, oh, we're so smart. But it's more like the science communication that works is science communication that isn't patronizing. It doesn't cast blame on the other person for their lack of knowledge, because not everyone is a scientist. I read an article shared by the Association for Science Communicators, and it was this African American professor, and he said, we always talk about science and society, but it's actually science with society, because we're a part of society. Science is happening within society. So I read that, after he said that, I can send you the article to put in the description box, but like he, science with society, that means not being patronizing, not being condescending. listening to people, really listening to like what they have to say and not judging them for their lack of information, because it's, as a scientist, it's your job to help them understand better. And there's a lot of people engaged in this work that I've been recapping the blogs at the 2024 AAAS annual meeting that was held in Denver, Colorado. AAAS, Association for the Advancement of Arts and Sciences here in the US, has a program called LSAN or something. Basically what it is they take scientists, there's a scientist that signs up to be in this program, then they go into the community and they hold different events. They may engage with policymakers, and just on a relational person-to-person level, not on an intellectual level. So I would say like the standard advice that people tell you for communication of anything, know your audience. That's the most important thing. Who are you talking to? What are their concerns? What do they not know? You can sometimes find this stuff out just by like talking to someone from your audience beforehand, before you do your work, because stuff like that, even though it's one person and it's not, it's not a randomized, it's not a scientific study, just knowing anything you can about your audience helps you a lot in communicating with them and establishing rapport, and having that connection between you as a scientist and science communicator and just whoever's in your audience. So the other thing I learned is don't try to change people's values, provide helpful information where they can make their own decisions, because people aren't going to change their values from talking to you. People don't change their values. Their values are kind of like an anchor for them in their lives. So talk to people on their own level, on their own terms, using the language they use, whatever languages they speak. That can help a lot. Just get on people's level, know your audience, and talk to them on their level as a person, not as someone that is less than you intellectually, but as someone, an equal partner in the discussion.
I totally agree with that. There are some issues with both trying to convince people by taking too abrupt leaps away from their values, their anchors. And sometimes we just need to use a little bit of a more diplomatic strategy to convince them. We cannot just bombard them with links and facts and data, because that will not change many people's mind.
You really do have to know your audience, you have to know the problem, and you have to know where your piece fits into the problem and makes it better. And if your piece doesn't fit into the problem and make it better for everyone involved, then it probably will get some pushback. Some days when I'm feeling really divided, I'm like, I have nothing in, like, what do I have in common with everyone that I can celebrate and value? And sometimes it's just like being alive, drinking clean water, having good air to breathe, just finding those places where you agree with people and use those as ways to build relationships. That can get rid of the pushback, being really specific about what you have to offer and how it will help someone. Don't just blindly force facts at someone and expect them to believe you, because their reality may be different than your reality.
Yeah. And I think it's okay that we have contradictory beliefs and that we don't agree with each other. I don't see much problems in having polarization, as long as we can deal with them. And we will always have differences in opinions, and we will learn from one another. We should be able to create an environment where people can at least discuss and engage in this type of discussions. We tackle different aspects of science communication. I think you're very interested in political science. I am as well, but in my content, I specialize more on the concept of philosophy of science, and or the concepts of science and philosophy of science. So do you see any differences in how we can or should communicate our respective fields?
Well, one of the things I talk about a lot at Fancy Comma and just also everywhere when I teach courses and stuff is just, as scientists, science communication is part of science, and we can communicate science, we can be engaged in the political process, bring our science to the table, because I think as scientists we have a lot to bring to the table, and our our scientific expertise is valued by lawmakers, it's valued by the community. We do science to help humanity. So we can actually help humanity by engaging in the political world on issues of great importance and engaging with communities and kind of building a community around support for science and helping communicate science to advance science literacy, to help people live better lives, to advance legislation. There's a lot of stuff that scientists can do that I think they never get told they can do, or maybe they think that they're too good for calling their lawmaker, or their lawmaker is, some power hungry guy that doesn't care. And that's the kind of mindset that basically shuts you out of being able to make any meaningful change. So science communicators, they have a lot of challenges in communicating their science. They can use different strategies like using figurative language, like metaphors and similes, avoiding jargon, and tying their science to the greater context of society, whether it's social context, economic context, political context. That's difficult because the political world, especially here in the US, is like quite dynamic right now. But like pop culture, tying science to pop culture can make science more fun. Tying science to society, politics, economy can make it seem more relevant to everyone's everyday lives. So I think scientists should try to learn some of these science communication strategies and incorporate them into their life's work, into their daily work as scientists, because we write tons of papers, we're constantly giving talks. Why don't we just learn a little bit of strategies that make our science just have a little bit larger amplification, allow us to kind of have this built-in capacity for like engagement with people. If people can understand you better, they're more likely to talk to you because they don't feel intimidated, they know what you're talking about. So I think we should move towards that, like at least knowing that we can communicate differently than the ways that we normally do in science. And we can even be science communicators like us, or science writers, or science journalists, or science policy experts. There's like, you don't have to stay in the lab because like people think, and the path is to just do science and like become a PI. Like you have a really good video where you talk about your path and how you wanted to run a lab. And I also wanted to run a lab, but I thought it would be cool. But there's a lot involved there. And if you just want to make an impact in the world using science, you don't have to run a lab, because what I've learned is that it's cool to be doing the science. It's amazing to be able to do that science. But something that's also amazing is to have a policy that is informed by science, or to, like as a teacher, I do a lot of teaching of science, and it's really fun when like a kid gets really excited about science and they get really excited about it and they are really happy because they just understood something. And I think that's just as valuable as making a research contribution. And I think it's not feasible for everyone to, as heartbreaking as it is for us with a science background, for everyone to like run a lab. We have to, especially when I think of our workforce, STEM workforce in 20 years, and I feel a little bit of anxiety because I wonder, what are people learning? Are they learning science? Is science being relegated to the lab? It should be done with society. So I think that those are all some ideas that can get scientists thinking about the reach of their work and the impact of their work, and the fact that they don't have to be in academic science just to advance the role of science in society. It's knocked over my board.
It's a nice painting, by the way. Oh, all right.
Oh my God. Hold on.
So I think academia also is trying to, in one way or another, to reach out with their science. I see many studies are trying to not simplify in a bad way, but simplify the writing and make it more readable for most people, with shorter sentences, less jargon, and all this type of thing, wherever it's not needed. we can think about the times before science communication, like or communicators such as Richard Feynman, Carl Sagan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are excellent or were excellent communicators. So my question is, if you think that these and other promoters of science communication have improved the conditions or approaches towards science communication, and how you have experienced the susceptibility of the general population to science and science communication, if you have any opinion around this, of course.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the science communication greats. Richard Feynman is like me, an MIT graduate. Carl Sagan is obviously a legend. Um, Neil deGrasse Tyson is, of those, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is the only one that's still alive. I mean, those are the people that as a science communicator, I look up to, but I know I can never be on their level, especially because I'm a life sciences person. I mean, I know I'm also a space nerd. I love NASA and I love like learning about space. And my classmate went to space, Jasmine Morbelli, aka Jaws, which I've talked about on our YouTube. And the level of personal commitment and sacrifice to science that these greats have is like kind of like it's really inspiring because when you think about not only science communicators but scientists, especially for me, women scientists like Katalin Karikó, who basically got demoted and then went to BioNTech and started doing her own thing, and then she won the Nobel Prize that way, just by carving her own unique path. Stuff like that really inspires me. And but yeah, but when it comes to like me, my experience as a science communicator, my favorite thing to do as a science communicator is to get young people interested in science and maybe inspire them to be a science communicator like me, or help them just at least like, because like for me, one of the things like when I used to say, when life gets crazy, the only thing that like really makes sense to me is just like math, theorems, scientific laws. Those things really make sense to me and they help me live a better life, like knowing how physics works so I can drive better, um, knowing how my brain works so I can be less stressed out. That kind of stuff really helps me in my life. And it's the science backs this up. When kids learn about things early on, like for example, if they have like early education programs, they have better life trajectories. So my whole thing, like when moms say they like make their kids like pancakes or something, but they put some spinach in there. Whenever I tutor or I substitute teach, I love to interject science into my lessons, like even if it's not like directly relevant. Like I was subbing for some middle schoolers in science. I was telling them about um, hormones and hormonal development. And they actually thought it was really cool. So that's like the really fun thing is getting kids thinking about science, because a kid that knows science is a kid that is equipped to deal with not only the challenges of their own life, but also to be part of the global STEM workforce. And so and it's also just really, young people have like the best energy. And maybe if we get young people interested in science early, then we won't have to do the science communication, science training. Maybe they will just all be thinking about science because they're all on TikTok. A lot of young people are really into like climate issues. And so um, it's been really interesting to interact with this growing population of young people, and that's the most rewarding
Yeah.
thing is that, and that's probably why Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman and Neil deGrasse Tyson, they could have just been like legendary. They are all legendary physicists, but they really had this desire to help humanity and help them live better lives, and that's why we're all so much better because of their um, kind of like selfless commitment to science communication to help us.
Yeah. So it seems to be going the right direction. At least we're improving science communication, and we're also seeing more of an engagement, and that you can see through the bubbling of people wanting to engage in this type of discussions, such as the COVID or CRISPR, AI, all this type of thing. that kind of shows that people want to participate and they want to learn more about it in one way or another. Then we have issues within that as well, but that's a different issue. But in general, I think that's a good sign. It's a good sign to see that that people are actively wanting to learn, and other people that want to learn. Just as a segue here, is our science communicators. We have a lot to learn now, especially if you want to get into the field as an independent science communicator. You need to learn how to write. You need to learn different types of science, how to research, and especially how to market yourself, how to show yourself availability. And that's where your book comes in. You have recently published a book called, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Science X Marketing or Science Times Marketing. Which one is it?
It is actually Science X Marketing. It's like a collab. It's not like Science Times Marketing. It's
Okay,
not
okay.
Science Cross Marketing.
All right. So
It's just Science X Marketing.
you recently published a book, Science X Marketing, which helps science communicators in the landscape, the science communication landscape, which is, from my own experience, was chaotic, completely chaotic when I started. So much information everywhere. Can you tell us a little bit more about this book and what inspired you to write?
So Science X Marketing, and I think you can relate to this. I don't know if the idea came to me as I was in the pandemic working on COVID communications, and I was like, wow, what is up with like no one knowing how to communicate science right now? I mean, there's a lot of scientists, they get on Twitter every day, they tweet stuff. And in the beginning of the pandemic, it was like maybe 3 or 4 people, and I'd check their tweets every day. But then suddenly it was like when someone had a PhD by their name, I was like, oh, I'm scared of what I'm about to read. Are they going to just say they're smarter than everyone and that like if you are vaccine hesitant, that's on you? Um, so I was like, wow, there's a really huge need for scientists to learn these communication strategies. And I think you were also working in this same field as me during this time. And so I was like, well, I'm going to just write a book about this and tell everyone like, hey, like make the case for scientists to become good communicators. And a lot of the examples I give are not just from marketing, but also from my own work as a political person, working on political campaigns, lobbying on Capitol Hill, helping elect senators. And a lot of that is like communications and marketing. And a lot of the stuff I talked about, knowing your audience. So there's scientists definitely, I definitely got so tired of working every day in the pandemic because I was like, I'm the only person with these skills. There's no one out there that has these combination of skills. And so I really wish there were more people out there that had these skills. So, and I did not know you at the time, but you're also working on this. But I think that there's a lot of people whose work probably has gone unnoticed, like selfless, thankless efforts of like all of us working in both of these worlds, communication as a writer and as a scientist. But I still feel like we need more. I feel like the pandemic revealed all of the different ways that we don't train scientists to communicate well. And unfortunately, when you don't train scientists in that, then the burden falls on communicators, and they don't often have a science background. And there's some rare people that have both. But so I hope that the main takeaway of my book is for scientists, anyone who reads it, to basically learn about this space. It's kind of like, I guess you could say it's like a Venn diagram of like science on one side and marketing on another side, and then Science X Marketing is like the middle part. But the name inspiration came from just like collabs. Like, for example, Target is a store here in the US, and they do collabs where like they'll have Target X Missoni. Missoni is like a really famous Italian designer that's famous for like their zigzag knitwear. So like they had a collab. So that's what it's like in my mind. Science X Marketing is like a collaboration between science and marketing. And so and I don't think we talk about that space. It's a very small space, but I think there should be more people working in that space. And I think that scientists can easily, whether by reading my book or checking out the fancy comma blog or watching your YouTube or however they decide to go about this, just learning a little bit about marketing can help them and can help the world so much.
I think it's a great initiative because like I said, I also had a quite big issues to understand what science communication was. What is the difference between science communication, scientific communication, medical communications? Most people who leave academia to communicate, they eventually become medical communicators because, well, that's where the money is. Very few people talk about science communication after academia. So I think it's a great initiative to try to structure all the jargons that we encounter and all the different paths that you can take in the field. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the contradictions also, because it seems that that's a theme today as well, the contradiction of between scientific accuracy and marketing, because we have, as we have discussed, we have a widespread engagement in science discussions, and which is often stigmatized by some. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we see vested financial interests in science. That includes journals, pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, political profiles, all this type of thing. So this can be seen as a contradiction, so a contradictory relationship, in that the general public requests participation and improve health and healthcare, while companies, politicians, and these other actors, they have their interests in science, often in the form of profit or money. So as a science communicator, how do you balance marketing? Since your title is Science X Marketing, how do you balance marketing or promotion of science or science communication or private companies while maintaining an unbiased approach that emphasizes accuracy and general trust in science and social participation in scientific discussion?
So that's a great question, and that is a huge problem in marketing, and that's something that, especially for science, the stakes are always really high in science. Everything happening in the scientific world has so many different implications, and I don't know how much you know about the ethics of marketing, but there's actually no established ethical guideline for marketers. Like there's best practices, but there's no like way to do marketing ethically. So what I think is that science marketers can hold themselves to a higher standard. They can learn about conflicts of interest. Let's say you are a journalist and you own stock in like Eli Lilly, and then you're reporting on Eli Lilly. Well, you probably shouldn't report on Eli Lilly, let's say for the New York Times, if you're a shareholder of Eli Lilly, because you may be more inclined to write favorable stuff about Eli Lilly that will cause people to buy more shares of Eli Lilly. And actually, I think that's like probably illegal, and that could get you investigated by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission here in the US. But it's stuff like that. Like things that are really, really unethical are usually illegal. But like there's all those gray areas where that you mentioned, the vested interests. And there's no real way to just completely get rid of vested interests because we live in a complex society. Like, as I mentioned, I'm a science writer. I work in the political world. I have my own political views. I have my own biases. But I try as much as possible to be transparent about those. And I also try to be nonpartisan where I can. And I've noticed that a lot of time the issue transcends politics or the and the ethics, like the ethics doesn't change across party lines. So it's always good to be ethical because I've learned a lot writing about marketing ethics and learning, and I talk a bit about it in Science X Marketing. There's a lot of really sketchy marketing practices that are used all the time that can actually get you fined. They can get you sued, not just in the US, but in the EU and in other places like Australia. So the onus is definitely on the marketer to not be unethical, and that means don't communicate deceptively, always communicate transparently. as a journalist, always know your conflicts of interest and seek to reduce them wherever possible, because that can harm your career in addition to potentially misleading people or um, stuff like that. So but we do live in a really complicated world, and in an ideal world, no one would have any conflicts of interest. But I think that but it's like ethics in marketing, like in marketing, um, and this is true for like all marketing, not just science marketing, but like people will do anything to get you to buy their product. And I don't think we should do that. And I think that what science brings is that evidence-based aspect. And that's why science marketers are so powerful, because they can just explain the science and they don't have to do so in a way that's coercive. They just explain it, in my mind, ideally just factually, and help people understand things rather than just like scaring them into buying something. Or I remember in the pandemic, one way that people wanted to get people to get vaccinated or prevent stuff was to just say they would all die, and that doesn't really work. It's not ethical to manipulate people into doing something, and it doesn't work because people are smarter than that. So, um, so yeah. So the ethics piece is actually missing in marketing, but I think that science marketers can hold themselves to a higher standard just because science is also, while it is amoral, there's a lot of ethics that we study in science, and we can bring that to our work as marketers as well.
Sheeva, thanks a lot for the discussion. A lot of information to take in, and I think that there is a lot of content here to share with the audience, and we will have people interested in different parts of this conversation. But just to conclude, where can our audience find more of your work and get a copy of your book? And if you have any final thoughts or messages that you would like to share with our viewers, then feel free to just inform them about that.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you. This was a really fun discussion and really important discussion, and one that I don't that I think is much needed, that I don't see happening. So I'm excited to be part of this discussion today. And in terms of final things, you can find out more about me at sheevaazma.com and learn more about Fancy Comma, and definitely check out our blog at fancycomma.com/blog. It's definitely a lot less philosophical than what Santiago does, but I like to think that our work is kind of complementary in the SciComm world. And it was great to chat with you today, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope that everyone watching today has learned something that they can take with them into their work and life. So thank you.
Definitely. I will add the links to Fancy Comma and your social media platforms in the description as well, so people can find you there, and maybe a link to wherever people can find your book as well. Let's hope you get a lot of attention or a lot of success with your book.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that I would love to see more scientists just engaged in these topics, maybe like learning about these topics on their own time. Like when I was a graduate student and stressed out, one of my favorite things to do would just be to hop on my laptop and watch random YouTube videos and discover new YouTubes. So hopefully someone will discover your YouTube as a scientist. And we really, as scientists, this conversation is way past due, especially after the pandemic. It's been my honor and pleasure to chat with you today, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
It was great.
So thank you,
Yeah.
Santiago.
Thank you, Sheeva.